Cool. Looks like we have about 198 people in right now.
Okay.
Just waiting for them to finish trickling in. Wonderful. Okay, let's dive right into this. I think that's the last of them. So hello, thank you for everyone who's joining in on this call. We're really grateful to have the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark, come join this with us. My name is Zeel Patel. I'm an undergrad at Harvard studying computer science. I'm a part of HPAIR, and this is my co-host, Emily.
Hi everyone, I'm Emily Fan and I'm also a student at Harvard studying environmental science and public policy. I'm actually born and raised in Auckland, in the best country in the world, which I'm sure Helen would agree with me on. And yeah, also very excited to have her join us today for this fireside conversation.
Sweet. As most of us know from the marketing that went out, the former Prime Minister, Helen Clark, she was also at the helm of the UNDP. She was ranked as Forbes' top 25 most influential woman of all time. And more interesting than that, she was actually voted as the most important New Zealander, which I didn't even know was the title. But if I could vote for that, I would give it to my fellow Kiwi here, which is Emily. And for those of you who aren't familiar, New Zealanders are called Kiwis, which I thought was fantastic. So to dive right into this, Helen, I had made my friends a promise. I had said that all of the questions that we would ask you, we would make sure that it wasn't anything that they could find on YouTube. So we wanted them to be really, really interesting. And Emily and I had actually taken the time to go through your documentary, My Life with Helen. And there was this really interesting moment where the camera actually pans over your phone. And with the corner of my millennial eye, I noticed something. You have the Snapchat app. So wait, does Helen Clark use Snapchat?
Yes, I do. And of course, it has a younger demographic using it than any of the other social media platforms. So yeah, I've got a loyal following on Snapchat, but what I like about Snapchat also is it has the best filters. So if you take a photo on Snapchat, then with the filters, then you could basically put it on your Instagram story and Facebook story, because with Snapchat, you're not necessarily going for the most arty photo, right?
Yeah.
But you're going for something that's a bit interesting and you could put a filter on it and say something about it. And that's also quite suited to the medium of Instagram story and Facebook story, which also fade after 24 hours. So yeah, it's a lot of fun, Snapchat. I recommend it.
Wait, that's really cool. I think you might be the coolest auntie that's on Snapchat. I've never heard of this before, but that's fantastic. And for those of us who are just trickling in and everyone else who's in, we'll have a Q&A session about 20 minutes afterwards, and you can submit your questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and your peers can upvote your question, and as soon as we start, we'll go from highest to lowest in terms of the upvoting. But without further ado, let's let Emily take it away.
Yeah, so Helen, I know you're joining us from Auckland right now, and I think a lot of people watching this are probably wondering at how New Zealand managed to deal with the coronavirus. We've had no new cases in the past week, I believe, and only have 1,500 or so cases in total. So do you think there are any aspects of how New Zealand dealt with the pandemic that are replicable for other countries? And do you think there's anything we could have done better or should keep in mind as we look towards economic recovery?
Well, firstly, while we report just over 1,500 cases, actually, we didn't get confirmed cases even of 1,200, but others were suspected cases. Yeah. So it has been really, by world standards, a pretty low per capita figure. Yeah. Has what we've achieved been something that could have been replicable? In my view, yes. Now, of course, I'll qualify that at the beginning by saying that whenever I tweet on this or anybody tweets on how New Zealand has done relatively well, you get all the knockers who say, oh, well, they're a little somewhere. Look, in this day and age, we are so globally connected, but we had to take a number of decisions that made our luck in this. So one of them was at the very beginning of February, when the epidemic was clearly a significant problem in China. We did stop flights from China. We did say that only people who were New Zealand residents or permanent or citizens could come to New Zealand from China, and they had to self-isolate anyway. And then we did the same with Iran and then with Italy. But of course, by the time we were getting there, the government was starting to look more closely at what was happening around the world. And quite early in March, I would think, New Zealand government threw out the flu pandemic plan, which most countries were still using. It said, this is not flu. This is something we have no experience with. And the advice they had, and acting on advice is actually rather important, was that they had a chance of eliminating the virus in New Zealand. If you've got a chance of eliminating something like this that you are seeing causing carnage elsewhere, you're going to take that chance. And so we put in place quite strict measures from around the middle of March, and that's been the secret to the success. If you ask what could have been done better, well, maybe it could have been done 10 days earlier. On the other hand, the public wouldn't have been sensitized to that. So all things considered, it's been a good response. It's one that's very much engaged the public, which basically agreed that they didn't want to end up looking like the scenes in Italy or Spain or New York or London or whatever either. So here we are, we're out the other end, but the problem is who else is out the other end? We can't even open the border with Australia at the moment because they're not out the other end of it. And it really is not a particularly encouraging situation globally at the moment.
Yeah, I've noticed that if you were to frame one country as the hallmark of handling it, it would probably be New Zealand. And then there are very, very few others, you're right. A question that I had that I thought was really interesting was about your time when you were at the UNDP. It was actually about how you would lead through crisis that was happening in other countries, because as some people on the call know, the funding for the UNDP comes from the individual member nations. And if you take a situation like what happened in 2016 when Brexit occurred, immediately afterwards, there was an austerity budget and that decreased funding for the UNDP. So how do you as a leader navigate through that when there's constant elections and your funding and your budget is being changed all the time, and knowing that perhaps you might not be able to keep the promises that you made to those in sub-Saharan Africa for the different initiatives that you were leading?
So normally the donors, when they're cutting, don't cut in the middle of the year, as it were, but they can lurch from quite a bit to nothing much from one year to the next. I remember, and I'll say it, Finland, because it's public, we used to get a useful, I don't know, $35 million a year from Finland. A new Conservative government was elected and slashed it to one. In fact, they wanted to make it to nothing. So, this is really not pretty helpful. And UNDP, when I was there, was the preeminent agency in the UN development system. So when you were funding UNDP, you were funding the system which led the country teams around the world and so on. But here's a point that's worth making in the context of today's news. As a leader of a UN organization, whether it's UNDP or UNICEF or the WHO or whatever, you never criticize a member state, because the member states, they make up the UN, you're a UN organization. So you have to work very diplomatically. And I think that the treatment that President Trump has meted out to the WHO today, saying they're ceasing all association with it, because it didn't, quote, criticize China or whatever. This is ridiculous. The WHO doesn't attack member states. It won't attack the US now. It'll turn the other cheek, because it tries to get everybody's cooperation.
I see. But a part of that was actually the criticism of the strategy that the WHO had taken in not alerting the member nations earlier. And I think that was what Trump was rallying behind. But I definitely don't agree with that. But I was thinking, if the WHO had that mandate and had that responsibility, obviously there would be a decrease in funding. But do you think that they should have alerted nations earlier?
Well, the WHO can only act on the information that it has, and then it gives guidance based on the information it has. Now, I have to say that the United States did not follow the guidance of the WHO. The WHO, on the 31st of December last year, was notified by China of this new virus. We all knew this. on the 31st of December. And then it went through its processes and was obviously liaising with China, the source of the virus. And on the 30th of January, it declared this disease as a public health emergency of international concern. Now that should send scare signals around the world.
Yeah.
But the most astonishing thing is that in North America and in Europe, with our most powerful Western economies, people sat and watched it coming. And I think they were probably a bit in the mindset of, say, Ebola, which if it had ever got away would have been a shocking thing, but it didn't. It was a long way away in West Africa. The odd case turned up at the US border, but nothing much. Similarly with SARS in 2003, China was much less globally connected, and SARS pretty well stayed confined where it had come from. Now, people didn't put two and two together and think, hang on, millions of Chinese people had just been traveling, including outside the country for Lunar New Year. If you go back to 2003, you didn't have busloads of Chinese tourists unloading at the Eiffel Tower in Paris, or the Empire State Building. That didn't happen. These days, China's very globally connected. So if there's a novel coronavirus coming out of China, you better be worried at this point in the 21st century. But these governments did nothing. Look, without just wanting to pop the US, if you take the European Union and their 27 member states, they had a meeting where the chief epidemiologists of all those member states met on the 18th of February, and they concluded and minuted that coronavirus posed no threat to Europe. Hello? Hello? I mean, this is how ridiculous people have been. I was in Geneva and with Dr. Tedros in the middle of February, and he said to me and others who were with him then, there's a very narrow window to avert a pandemic, but it is closing fast, and I don't know what I can do to stop it happening because nobody is listening.
Yeah, so Jacinda Ardern, has been praised globally for how she approached the pandemic, and I know a lot of parallels are drawn between you two, both being strong female leaders. I think most people in the audience probably aren't aware, but she apparently worked as a researcher in your office when she just graduated university. So I think a lot of people are probably also curious what you think made you stand out and get to your current position of influence. Was it something in your background, your education, maybe being a woman, entering a very male-dominated environment?
It's interesting to me that New Zealand's 3 women prime ministers have all been from all-girl families, and they've been the oldest in the family. I think this actually is not insignificant. So they're used to being leaders from a young age in their little family units, and there were no boys around competing with them, and their parents, obviously were parents who were very affirmative of their education and seeking opportunities and so on. And in the little bubble of New Zealand, it hasn't necessarily been easy for women to top. And Jacinda still to this day gets an enormous amount of gender-based and sexist and quite misogynist criticism. But nonetheless, that's a minority. The majority of people will go with what works. And if they see a woman leader who can foot it, they'll back her.
Yeah, so you are a big advocate for gender equality, and I know that COVID-19 is impacting men and women very differently. It's aggravating economic inequalities faced by women, and also the rates of gender-based violence. So would you view this pandemic as a big step back for gender equality, or is it perhaps an opportunity for greater equality in the workplace and at home?
Actually, the pandemic is incredibly threatening to women and children. Why do I say that? What we know from the Ebola pandemic was that more people died of preventable diseases and preventable conditions in pregnancy and childbirth than died of Ebola. Now, of course, you had to stop Ebola, but the problem is in countries with very fragile health and social systems and economies, if you are weighed down by a pandemic, things tend to stop. And so what we're seeing now in the poorest countries is the normal health services not operating. Children are going without their vaccinations. You won't be able to deal with cholera. Women aren't getting their family planning advice. They're not getting the care they need in pregnancy. They're not getting to deliver their baby with a skilled birth attendant. So there is a huge amount of worry about this. I'm the chair of the Partnership for Maternal, Newborn and Child Health, and we have just had a major online event a couple of nights ago, which I co-chaired with the president of Estonia, and had the head of UNICEF and many other high-level people on talking about these impacts and really raising the awareness of governments of the need to prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable through this pandemic. And that certainly includes women and children. You're right also to point to the prospect of more child abuse and more violence against women when people are locked up in small places, more unwanted pregnancies. So it's a huge issue for women and for children.
Mm. One of the things that I wanted to ask about, because you brought up Jacinda, and this is something I've been interested in for a long time, but as former heads of state, do you communicate still with the current leadership, like the current government? Do you reach out and like text them and say like, hey, if you need a mentor, or like, oh, bad policy intervention or something like that? Like, what is the level of communication like, both on a domestic level with the New Zealand government, but also internationally when you did your state visits or you met with Nancy Pelosi and all of them? What is that relationship like now?
Well, I've been in leadership positions for a very, very long time, right? I became the deputy prime minister of my country in 1989, and then I became the leader of the Labour Party in the end of 1993, leader of the opposition. And I've always had a lot of connections with social democratic parties going back to the 70s. So there's people I knew when I was a young political activist who rose to the very top of their political systems. But then, of course, as Prime Minister, as UNDP administrator, I kept moving in circles of leaders. So yes, I have huge networks, and I do. I am a member of former leaders' clubs, as it were, like the Club de Madrid, which is a great one. And there's others too, where people do get together and network. And I've been quite busy the last few weeks with those networks organising for people to come in behind letters to the G20 leaders, for example, and to the Security Council to basically set out the agenda of what needs to be done. I mean, we live in a world where there is a gigantic leadership vacuum. I mean, to give you an example, the Security Council has not passed a single resolution on this pandemic. Go back 6 years, September 2014, the Security Council declared in a formal resolution that Ebola was a threat to global peace and security, and asked member states to do whatever they could to avert this threat and support those who were affected. We've had absolutely nothing like that. No resolution whatsoever from our Security Council. Failure of leadership. Secondly, with the global financial crisis, Prime Minister Gordon Brown of the United Kingdom rallied leaders, and they had a very significant summit in Paris, as I recall, in April 2009, and they produced $1 trillion package for the IMF and the World Bank to bail out countries which were affected by the GFC. We have had no action of that kind either, and the letters that I've been organising with Gordon Brown and others are going to G20 leaders now, and we have another one coming next week, basically spelling out the $2.5 trillion package. That's what the IMF says is needed. The IMF is a queue of more than 100 countries asking it for emergency support. It can't support them, hasn't got the money. It can support the very poorest, the poorest 25, it's waiving their debts. But if you think of the Caribbean, for example, and the totally tourism-dependent economies of middle income and often upper middle income countries, these countries have got no income. They're going to need an IMF package, but there's no money to fund it. So someone needs to do what Gordon Brown did back in April 2009 and rally the troops for the package, which will enable the international financial institutions to stop countries, and they're not necessarily very poor countries, they can be high middle income countries, going over the cliff.
Actually, this brings up a very good point that I wanted to ask. When you were UNDP head, you went to a lot of these developing countries and in Africa and all around the world. And going through the crisis right now, what I wanted to know is if you were to pick one country that was a heavily indebted poor country that you would bet on would grow out of this in the future and 10 years down the road would become one of the biggest developed countries, what country would you pick and why? Even just barring the crisis, like the ones that had high trajectories before, which one really interested you?
Well, I did have the opportunity to travel to an enormous number of the world's countries throughout my career, and I still was actively actually before this pandemic struck. Look, I've taken a particular interest in what is like a wall of fire that runs across the Sahel and the Maghreb, west and north of Africa, right across to the Horn. And you have countries there with so much potential. You know, they've got the youthful demographics, which could really fire a transformation. But they're brought down by a mix of terrible challenges. Terrorism's taken root in a number, obviously a lot of conflict in others. And it's kind of distressing to see. So you look at countries in there that aren't as affected by the conflict issues. You know, Ghana should take off. Senegal should take off, but not without significant support. And but they are stable countries inherently, and stability is an absolute precondition for development. If you don't have stability, and if you're always fighting like Somalia or Central African Republic or any other number of tragic places, you can't develop. You can't offer your people security and hope.
Yeah. I was like, we can't launch into Q&A before I slip in a question about climate change. I study environmental science, so it's an area that I'm particularly interested in. So when you were in office, you had a goal for New Zealand to become the world's first carbon neutral country, and you introduced the emissions trading scheme. But now, more than a decade later, New Zealand still has the 5th highest per capita emissions in the world amongst the OECD. So, what do you think went wrong, or what would you have done differently, if anything? And, what are your thoughts on the current government's approach to tackling emissions reductions?
Well, what went wrong was there was a change of government at the end of 2008. And when I was Prime Minister, you still couldn't get the main opposition party, Conservative Party, to take climate change seriously. So we had set a target way back around 2006-07 for New Zealand to be carbon neutral, zero carbon by 2020, and that was entirely achievable. But the next government came along in 2008 and basically threw it all out and stopped doing the things you would need to do to reach that. So when Jacinda Ardern's coalition government came in, and she has also Greens in the coalition, we also always had Green support of some kind or another when I was PM. She and her government have started back down the same road. One thing that is reasonably significant is that when the zero carbon legislation went through the New Zealand Parliament in recent months, the main opposition party did vote for it. But okay, that means at least they're not denying science anymore. But the issue will be whether, when there's a change of government, and it's not if, it's when, right? I mean, governments don't last forever in democratic countries. The cycle goes round. Will they then start to claw back on the measures that make it possible? So we need much more bipartisan, cross-party buy-in to the measures that are necessary to reach these targets.
Yeah, that can be applied to the rest of the world, actually, especially the United States.
Well, that's right. I mean, President Obama had some good initiatives going, and they've just been not only in the climate change area, but across the board, and they've just been systematically trashed by his successor.
Wonderful. So with that lovely comment, I'd like to move into the Q&A so the audience gets a chance to engage. The first one that we have is, speaking of President Obama, the governments of New Zealand and Taiwan and Germany have all suggested that female leaders have coped with the crisis a lot better than male leaders. And the attendee asked, specifically, why do you think that is the case, that females do better in times of crises?
So what I've said on this subject, and there's been many interviews on it, is that on average, the women leaders have done better than the men. Not all women leaders have done well in this crisis. If you look at Belgium, it's had a terrible pandemic and clearly hasn't acted the way other countries very close to it have, because not so far from Belgium is Denmark, which has done extremely well. Norway's done well with a woman leader. So has Finland, so has Iceland. So it's not just New Zealand. Angela Merkel in Germany, virtually adjacent to Belgium, has done very well. So what are the characteristics of doing well with this pandemic? It's about being consultative. It's about listening to the range of scientific advice and making good decisions. It's about being empathetic. Those who were just running with the so-called herd immunity idea clearly had very little regard to the value of human life, because herd immunity, unless you were going to completely seal the residents and staffs of your old folks' homes, was just going to kill and maim old people, right? And that's been a terrible story out of the US, out of the UK and other places. So these women leaders have put human health and life and human security first, and have been prepared to engage their populations, implement good policies based on good advice. So I think that those are attributes which, while often associated with women's leadership, aren't unique to it. If men also were more consultative and empathetic and listened and took advice and didn't let a big ego get in the way, they could have a good response to a pandemic as well. I think, for example, the president of Korea has done well, male president. And there's other male leaders who've done well. But on average, they haven't. On average, the women have.
Yeah.
Yeah, so our next question is, what do you anticipate the implications of the pandemic will be on international development goals and collaboration on those efforts?
If there isn't a concerted, globally coordinated response, not only in the health area, but in this broader economic and social area, with the $2.5 trillion the international financial institutions need to stop countries going under, there's not, to be honest, a hope in hell of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Those goals talk about eradication of extreme poverty by 2030. Now, there's a whole range of estimates as to what will happen to extreme poverty as a result of the pandemic. At the bottom end, you have the World Bank, which said between 40 and 60 million more people thrown into extreme poverty. And at the other end, you've got Andy Summers from King's College London and a consortium of academics who published a paper out of UN University saying it would be upwards of 450, 480 million. It's quite a broad range. But even if it were the bottom end, this would be the first time this century that we've gone backwards on extreme poverty, not seen it increase rather than reduce. Similarly with hunger, the World Food Programme is estimating that on top of the 135 million people pre-pandemic who were at starvation levels of hunger, you could add another 130 million to that. So you're talking about over 250 million people at the brink of starvation. Of course, the total numbers which have been hungry have been running in at about 831 million a year anyway, and we were supposed to eradicate hunger. I mean, I could go on. We were supposed to guarantee that every child by 2030 would have the ability to have 12 years education. Well, we've got a whole lot of kids out of school now as a result of lockdowns and the pandemic who may never get back. We will go backwards on maternal mortality and on child mortality. So it is a very serious situation. The whole agenda has been derailed by the pandemic. Now, we could avert that, but it's going to mean countries digging deep for the international response, and we don't have evidence that that will happen yet.
You brought up the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals, and there's a topic that I really wanted to bring up that I don't see in the Q&A, so I'm going to interject really quickly. It was the UN Secretary General election that you had run for in 2016. We followed through the process and we saw all 6 straw polls, and in the end, the former Prime Minister of Portugal was elected and not you. And you had said that that was the first time in your career that you felt that there was a ceiling, that you couldn't go any higher. And we know you did a whole bunch of state visits and went to Washington and Paris and all of them to talk to the P5 nations. But in the end, what do you think was the determining factor for why those 3 P5 countries didn't vote for you?
Well, it wasn't just that they didn't vote for me. They didn't vote for a woman candidate.
Yeah.
And the majority of the candidates were female. And the women candidates were as well, if not better qualified than any of the men. You have to be into shooting position as a woman still in this day and age. You have to be better. But what also characterizes the women is that because we've had to fight our way up into levels of decision making which haven't been that open to women, of course we are strong, we're independent minded, we get things done, and that can be very frightening to some people. And with the Security Council Permanent 5, there was really only one country that put its neck out and said, look, we want a Secretary General who's strong, a leader, and will really lift the whole place. And that was the United Kingdom. For the others, no, they'd rather not have the Secretary General getting in the way.
Including Samantha Power?
Sorry?
Including Samantha Power?
Well, I don't think we should individualize it to Samantha, who I have a great deal of respect for, and I do fully recommend her book, by the way. It's one of the most engaging autobiographies I've ever read that came out in the last year or so. But no, I mean, she represents the United States of America. It's not her call. And I think with respect to the United States, not only have they traditionally not wanted a strong Secretary General, I think in the case of New Zealand also they would find issues, even though you had the Obama administration, which was one of the most enlightened of all times. Nonetheless, New Zealand is an independent-minded country with an independent foreign policy, which I've been very associated with over the years. And I think they would look at New Zealand and think, well, a New Zealander, not controllable. That's the reality.
I mean, for what it's worth, like Emily and I really admired the fact that you ran in the first place, and we thought it was very respectable. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the next question is from Jessie Lee, and basically she's asking, with everything that's happening in the world right now, how do you avoid getting bogged down in the mire of politics? How do you stay inspired to do good in the world?
Well, I think we have to keep trying, for good responses and outcomes. And I mean, I still have quite a very substantial social media following and a voice, and get run by the world's media channels. So I've probably spent the last 3.5 months non-stop on COVID-19 to stay on top of all the issues and to work with the many organizations that I'm part of to see how we can respond. So there's no point just sort of packing it all up and thinking this is hopeless, I'll just go and watch movies and so on. That's not my nature. I mean, the situation is not very encouraging, let's face it. But things can change. I can say it. And change in the United States in November would be a huge boost for the world in trying to get back onto a course where we could work together cooperatively and not forget about the poorest and most marginalized people in other countries and work to make the multilateral system work. So you have to look for where you could perhaps make an impact, but giving up is never an option.
Yeah. Unfortunately, none of us are U.S. citizens on this among the three of us, so we can't vote. But the next question is from Hassan, who asks that you recently signed an Oxfam letter calling for the people's vaccine, which is a vaccine free of charge available to everyone. He was wondering how you would go about the actual implementation of this from a fiscal point of view. How would that be financed? How would it be affordable, and a distribution point of view? I mean, also what your thoughts were on voluntary patent pools.
Yeah, look, there's many aspects to this, but if we go back to first principles, Dr. Salk, who invented the Salk vaccine, which enabled us to virtually eradicate polio, said he never wanted a cent of royalty out of that. He said, I've had the privilege of inventing something that will save lives and prevent significant disability. So we need whoever comes up with a vaccine, and there may be different varieties, obviously, to be prepared to take this off patent and let it be manufactured widely so that everybody can benefit. Now, there are mechanisms at the World Health Organization for patent pools. There's also the fact that a lot of these vaccines are being developed with significant public money. For example, you'll find the US government is putting a lot of money into some of the research teams. So is the UK, even New Zealand's putting money into research teams here. And wherever there's public money in, you expect public good. Now, what should happen is it should be available off patent, and that means that countries can then use the flexibilities under the Trade and Rights and Intellectual Property Agreement of the WTO, the TRIPS agreement, to issue compulsory licenses to enable it to be manufactured widely. So, with a will, there's a way. What we're waiting for, of course, is the vaccine, and you hear many things. I mean, it's not easy to develop this vaccine. The normal time, would not be a year. It might be a minimum of 4, it might be 10, but at least the world's best research brains are working on this, so the cycle could be cut shorter. But then we really need to see it rolled out, sequenced, first to the most vulnerable and to health workers, and then through populations as widely as possible.
And I'm an optimist. I've read a lot of articles about how the pharmaceuticals in the US are leading that. So I hope that is the case. As for the final question, because we know you do have to run, just yesterday, the seniors from Harvard had graduated and they had their commencement, and they're off to the real world now. And one of the questions asked, what would be your biggest piece of advice to the young people, both in the current climate and the future, and the leaders that are coming out of Harvard College as of yesterday?
Well, my advice would be to take a commitment to do good for humanity into whatever you do, whether it's business, whether it's teaching, whether it's the philanthropic world. Wherever you are, you can make a difference for the better for somebody. And you should determine to do that, not just say it's all about me. It's not just all about you. It's a privilege to be alive. It's a privilege to have a Harvard education. Use it for not only for yourself, but for what you can do for your society and your organization.
No, thank you for that. Emily, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, so that wraps up our Q&A for today. But I just wanted to say, a big thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to join us. I know for a lot of us, me included, we kind of grew up with your name like on television and followed your work. So it's such an honor to be able to speak with you today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, and on behalf of us on the organizing committee, both at HPR and Oscar, thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you, Helen, for taking the time to join this call. And if you'd be interested, we're having a call with the Prime Minister of Thailand in a month from now, so be on the lookout for that. But thank you, everybody. There'll be a feedback form when you leave. Thank you, Helen.
Thanks.